Hello, students. Today our discussion will be on the Black Lives Matter movement. What is a movement? In our course, we are referring to the social and political movements. In a social or political movement, a group of people with a common ideology work together to achieve certain goals. For example, the civil rights movement in America. In the 1950s and 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. was the leader of the civil rights movement. In April 1963, Martin Luther King went to Birmingham, Alabama, a city where public facilities were separated for blacks and whites. King intended to force the desegregation of lunch counters in downtown shops through a non-violent protest. As the Birmingham campaign continued, the images of police brutality on the protesters shocked the world and gained a lot of sympathy for the civil rights movement. In 1965, King led the Selma to Montgomery March. After a series of incidents and demonstrations, the civil rights movement was successful in gaining certain rights for African Americans. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and in 1965, the African Americans were granted the right to vote. But this slide shows that discrimination still continuing in the American society against the African Americans and now against some immigrants. So in 1963, the slide shows that there were separate schools for the African Americans in some sections of the American society, and the other slide shows the picture shows that in 2011 there was some discrimination against the Latinos in the American society. In this slide, we see the writing Black Lives Matter and Confront White Supremacy. This slide also took me to the historical past. As I was walking in the National Mall near the White House in Washington, D.C. in September 2017, this banner, Black Lives Matter, drew my attention. And then the placard, Confront White Supremacy. So it tells us that America has issues. There are issues of civil rights, equality for all Americans is needed. So the Black Lives Matter movement, it started in 2013. So but it soon gained momentum. As we know that historically there was this John Laws legalized black segregation in the southern states. Later in the 50s and 1960s, there was the civil rights movement, and we have heard of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech, I Have a Dream. He called for equal civil and economic rights and an end to racism in the United States. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed to end racial segregation, and in 1965, African Americans were granted voting rights. But still, in today's society, this banner, Black Lives Matter, shows that African Americans are being discriminated in the American society. So, as a historian, I started thinking about this banner Black Lives Matter movement, which was found in 2013 when an American man was acquitted for shooting an African American teenager to death. Then the movement, Black Lives Matter movement, came to public attention after the unarmed 18-year-old Michael Brown, who was not armed, in the city of Ferguson, Missouri, was shot by a white police officer. So this led to riots in Ferguson, in Missouri, in the United States. And there were other riots earlier in 1992, the Los Angeles riots. So that's the reason the Black Lives Matter banner is there. As I said, historical inquiry is very important in the discipline of history. We see an incident happening in the present, then we go back to the past and try to find the history of the present event. So in May 2020, a horrendous incident again took place in America. On 25th May 2020, an unarmed African American, an African American man named George Floyd, who did not carry any arms, he was killed by a white American police officer in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. So the incident took place in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, in the United States, but soon the outrage against discrimination and the slogan for equality to all was in America, in many states. Then again, the outcry reached overseas. So people in Australia, people in different European countries, they were sympathetic to the African American cause. They held the banner Black Lives Matter, and they had rallies and protests. So now we see a local event, a local incident in America, in Minnesota, touched the people, many Americans of all colors, both black and non-black, and they marched and they protested against the injustice done to the African Americans. And this protest reached out from America nationally to internationally. Overseas, people protested against the injustice and discrimination against the African Americans. African Americans are still being discriminated in the American society. As we can see in this slide, that they are discriminated in the employment sector. The black unemployment rate is double than that of the whites. African Americans are jailed at 5 times the rate of white Americans. Black mothers die in birth child at over twice the rate of white mothers, and there are inequalities across school systems, housing, and other public resources. Now, people are calling for substantial reforms to counter racism in the law enforcement sector, the employment sector, health and education, because Black lives matter.